taught the seminary since 1999. Recently became co-pastor at Life Church in Lancaster. He is a prolific writer and has published many books and articles. If you're interested in Greg's published works, check out his faculty page at lancasterseminary.edu. He has appeared on BBC, PBS, the Discovery Channel, and the History Channel, and has frequently contributed to the Christian Century and the Huffington Post. He fields media interviews regarding biblical studies and the interface of contemporary Christianity and politics. Perhaps the most impressive thing Greg has accomplished is playing Harding Park Golf Course in San Francisco, where the 2020 PGA Championship was held. There are a few other golf courses that he touts as well, but they will remain unnamed. He will speak to us tonight about what the Bible says on certain subjects and how the church and people who call themselves Christian have often misinterpreted the Bible on a whole host of subjects. The question then becomes, for people of faith who claim the authority of Scripture, how do we relate to the Scriptures in a faithful way? Please welcome my friend and golfing partner, Dr. Greg Carey.
It's good to see all of you, and I need to unmute. Yay, it's good to see all of you, and especially friends I haven't seen in a long time. We had slides going that, for whatever reason, didn't work out, and Steve knows how to do it. It didn't work out. But the title is The Immoral Bible. And how do you talk about the Bible in ways that treat it as the book we actually have? That's language I've stolen from a colleague who's gotten to be pretty famous, Pete Enns, who teaches at Eastern University. Pete and I, in a common way, have conservative evangelical backgrounds where you thought you would do whatever the Bible told you to do and believe whatever the Bible told you to believe. And then that got more and more complicated, and you came up with ways of trying to make sense out of the Bible when it felt like it didn't make sense. And then you came to terms with, what do I do with the Bible when it's immoral? And so what I'd like to do with the time that I'm talking at you, and we're not talking as much together, is tell a couple of stories that are personal. Not too personal, you don't need to leave. To sort of embody that process, and then start getting a little bit nerdy about ways that Christians have rationalized our relationship with the Bible that are starting not to work well, and finally try to arrive at a place of how can we deal with the Bible we have, still love it, still engage it, but in a way that is authentic to what we think we know. One of the things I'll share is, on the front end, this is just something I believe. I don't know it's true. It seems to be true. You can't make yourself believe something just because you want to believe it. You can for a while, but it doesn't stick. So the first story I'll tell you is, I was a high school convert at First Baptist Florence, Alabama. It was a healthy church. If you hear Baptist in Alabama, I can imagine you might have thoughts. But no, it was a very healthy place to have that experience. And it took immediately. I began seriously to read the Bible and participate in the ministries of the church. And so when I was 16, I was invited to preach on Youth Sunday. Now, if you know anything about Southern Baptist culture, this is a First Baptist church in a county seat university town, not a huge town, but not a small church. You have a very professional, well-educated pastor. What I'm trying to tell you is I didn't get Sunday morning. But you have worship on Sunday night, and it's less formal, and you might trot out a kid then. The sermon I preached, I plagiarized, because I didn't know that was wrong. And how would I have come up with anything, right? at that age. And I had heard a prominent, in fact, he became president of the Alabama Baptist Convention, and he preached a sermon on Saul and the Amalekites. So I'm a man. Okay, thank you, Sarah Jane. Yep. So the story goes that the prophet Samuel tells Saul it's time to go to war against the Amalekites because they were mean to the Israelites hundreds of years ago. Right? None of them are still living, the people. But here's the verse, 1 Samuel 15:3. Go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have. Do not spare them. Kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. By the way, there have been leaders of the Israeli government who are referring to Palestinians as Amalek language. Mm-hmm. So this is the language of genocide. And according to the Bible, Saul kills everybody except the king, and he keeps some of the livestock. And as a result, Samuel lets Saul know that God is done with him, and he won't be king or alive much longer. Now, the sermon I heard and kind of repeated was about 95% obedience. Saul was 95% obedient, and that was as good as zero. That was the sermon. There was nothing in there about killing, everybody, children, women. Nothing about the livestock either. Just that Saul had been commanded, and he did almost all of it, and not enough. And that was not enough to please God. So I preached that. I don't remember anybody nudging me about it. And somebody somewhere in the area of my hometown heard about it, and I got invited to preach at a little country church. And what I do, I preach the same sermon. I want to tell you, if you know how Southern Baptist services used to work, they always end in an altar call where people can come forward if they need to dedicate their life to Christ or just join the church or I gave the altar call. I've never seen this since then. Everyone came forward. The pianist stopped playing and came forward at this plagiarized, atrocious sermon that I wouldn't think was atrocious for years. So when I hear the Speaker of the House of Representatives say, I am a Bible-believing Christian, someone asked me today in the media, they said, people are curious, what does Mike Johnson think about any issue under the sun? I said, well, go pick up a Bible off your shelf and read it. That's my worldview. And of course, Christians who pick up the Bible draw all kinds of different messages from it, right? If you look at the public statements of various denominations on immigration, labor, climate change, gender, sexuality, just down the list, you realize that Christians don't align in their theological understandings or their understandings of the Bible. I've come to believe that when someone says, I just read the Bible and do what it says, that it's really a power play. But they may or may not know that. What do people do, though, if they encounter the Bible and it feels like it's not giving them good news? Well, one option is to just try to make yourself be okay with it. And then you can create an institution like the Creation Museum in Kentucky, where you have, humans and dinosaurs frolicking together. A more common line in mainline Protestantism being like the United Church of Christ, like the Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Methodists, Lutherans, Disciples, American Baptists, is to say something like this. The Bible is divinely inspired, and it's authoritative, here's the language, authoritative in matters of faith and practice. In other words, okay, when we read the Bible, we don't really think the earth was created 6,000 years ago in 7 days. And when we read the Bible, we recognize that some passages seem to contradict the perspectives of other passages. But when it comes to what we believe and how we should live, we can trust the Bible in matters of faith and practice. So we can sort of put a protective barrier around the Bible and say, we don't mean that, we mean this. That game is played in lots of church settings, and so I'm going to tell you the second story. You only get 2. Uh-oh, 3. Forgot that one. As a young convert, I hear often, you should read your Bible. And in the church, I found these little pamphlets that had a schedule for reading the Bible through in a year. So I asked my mom for a Bible. She got me a Bible. And I didn't grow up in church. And I got highlighters. And, highlighted the stuff that was really good. And read the Bible through twice in high school and my first year of college. Taking it very seriously. Sometimes I would have questions, but I assumed there was an answer to my questions. I just didn't know how to pursue it, right? What would you do? And about 20 years later, I thought, it would be really cool to see what I highlighted and what I didn't. Right? So I took that Bible, and I would have brought it, but my wife and I redid our house last summer, and we still haven't unpacked. I don't know where it is. But, I'm not surprised by what I found. Certain books of the Bible are just all kinds of colors. Gospel of John, big for evangelicals. Romans, big for evangelicals. And then I thought, I wonder what I did with a passage in Ephesians that's called the household codes. So the household code in Ephesians starts this way. Submit to one another as you would submit to Christ, which sounds great in a way. Wives, submit to your husbands. What do you imagine a 16 or 17-year-old straight male in Alabama did? I highlighted that. That made sense. Next, children, obey your parents. I did highlight it. I think I remember highlighting it grudgingly. Like, I guess I got it. Third, slaves submit to your masters is the language. I would translate that differently now. But, I wish I could reconstruct it. I think I know what happened. But let's say it was 1981, in Alabama, public school kid, classmates, teammates, classmates 20% black, teammates 30 or 40% black. Something in me didn't highlight that. Like there was something I knew, but hadn't articulated to myself at that age. That just didn't seem highlightable. Of course, highlighting didn't mean I agree or disagree. It meant this is stuff I really like and need to remember. But I treated that differently because I had some inkling that slavery in the Bible had something to do with slavery in the United States and things I was experiencing in my daily life then. And that's what I mean by immoral Bible. It's still the case that if I go into a seminary classroom and start talking about that passage, more often than not, a student will defend the passage. They'll say, well, you know, it says that it starts by saying we all submit to one another. And I'll point out, yes, but then the people doing the submitting after that are the women, the children, and those who are enslaved. And they're all submitting to the same man. Well, but the passage about women really says more to the man than it does to the woman, because it tells him how he's obligated to love and take care of her and love her as Jesus loved the church, which, he gave his life for the church. Yeah, but he doesn't have to submit. This is all, there are a lot of people that have, made that okay. And at some point, and usually as a teacher, I'm trying to draw people out, but at some point I'll say, but you realize that it puts women in the same position that it puts children and slaves. And you don't persuade people just, in a minute like that. But, sometimes the rationalization, and then please forgive me if this is offensive, I'll say, they fucked their slaves, right? Male and female, adult child. You know that, right? But we'll do a lot to hold it together that there's not a problem. So I wish I could show you this slide just because it's a picture of one of my college professors. His name was Michael McLean, and I wound up, meeting distribution. I didn't intend to become a religion major, but it wound up that way. And he's one of the reasons. I had to take a distribution requirement in religion. He was the professor, theology professor. I had never met a true theological liberal. If you don't know what that means, for a Southern Baptist, he said things I couldn't imagine could be said. Does God know your thoughts? Well, of course God knows your thoughts, but wouldn't God respect your privacy? And that was pretty disruptive at that stage in my life. But that was just a start, right? And one day I made an appointment with Michael and just shared with him that, we're starting to think about some things I'm not familiar with, it's uncomfortable, and somehow Michael had the wisdom to say, Greg, is there anything you could learn that would cause you to question your relationship with God? And remember, I'm a Southern Baptist. My relationship with God has an intellectual component, but it's rooted here. Jesus lives in my heart. And when I say that, you notice I said it in the present tense. That is how I relate to God now. It hasn't changed. And when he asked the question, immediately I knew the answer. I don't have to be afraid of information. I don't have to be afraid of questions. It's not about that. And that really was an advanced step in my process of faith, to be willing to trust and be open, and I don't want to say be not defensive, but less defensive. So by the time I had finished seminary, 27 years old, and realized I wanted to do academic work and PhD work related to the Bible, I still hadn't worked through all these things, but now I'm asking very different questions. And if I shared them with people who shared my background of, the Bible tells you that's what you believe, you can trust it, and it's good, right? Morally good. Because remember, the hedge was always, you can trust the Bible to be good. And it looked like I was talking to people, and it is like you're talking to people who you can't possibly think that. What kind of modern horrible stuff has happened to you? But I began to learn Christians have asked this question out loud at least since the 3rd century and probably since the 2nd. It's been there. And so For example, we might consult Origen of Alexandria, writing in the early 3rd century. And he takes up the Amalekite story and others. He writes, "As for the command given to the Jews to slay their enemies, anyone who looks carefully into the meaning of the passage will find it's impossible to interpret it literally." Now, what Origen did was come up with ways that weren't literal to turn it into making sense. But what you see is him acknowledging, and he writes this in a dispute with a pagan philosopher named Celsus. He knows that pagan critics of Christianity are saying, this Bible is full of some stuff here. And so we have to figure out a way. It's a problem for Origen. More around the year 400, we get Augustine. As for passages which had previously struck me as absurd, now that I heard reasonable explanations of them, I regarded them as of the nature of profound mysteries. Right? The true meaning can't be what it says. It must be something else. Later, Augustine says something that is really important for how these things work. A method for determining whether I'm going to say passage, is literal or figurative must be established. Like, do you take it the way it is or find a spiritual, allegorical meaning? Whatever appears in the divine word that does not literally pertain to virtuous behavior or to the truth of faith, you must take to be figurative. In other words, it doesn't mean what it seems to say. It must mean something else. In the same passage he writes, virtuous behavior pertains to the love of God and of one's neighbor. The truth of faith pertains to knowledge of God and of one's neighbor. This is Augustine's famous rule, that interpreting the Bible, you interpret it according to 2 rules or laws. The rule of love: if my interpretation doesn't help me love God and my neighbor more, it can't be the best interpretation. And the rule of faith: if my interpretation runs counter to the creed, it can't be the right interpretation. So there must be another way, the rule of faith and the rule of love. Christians have been finding ways to deal with the parts of the Bible that are deeply immoral just about since we started thinking these things through and writing to each other about. And I hear in the kinds of churches I'm in now a lot of things that don't work, but people like to say. So this is where, for some of you, you're like, yeah. I knew that. Lots of Christians like to say, well, the bad stuff is in the Old Testament, and the good stuff is in the New Testament. Well, I read from Ephesians just now. Right? Or there must be a way to pick and choose the passages we listen to, and we can separate them from one another. Or, this is pretty common, there must be like this progressive revelation. This is close to Old Testament, New Testament. Like, not that God got smarter, but God had to work with people the way they were. And as you work through the Bible, you get more and more and more truth. So that you can judge the earlier parts. Or you can go by Jesus. Right? But have you noticed how often Jesus uses slavery as a metaphor for how Christians ought to act? Or how often he uses characters who are enslaved in his parables? By the way, a new book by a friend of mine, Candida Moss, and I forgot the title of the book, but it's about slavery and its fundamental role within the emergence of the New Testament of Christianity. And very much, when you hear someone say, I want to be a servant leader, that's enslaved. Like, it's meant to not make sense. I don't think we have to rationalize. And I don't think it's healthy to rationalize, period, when we're doing it. But also, if you're a religious leader, I recommend not doing it because things have changed in the 32 years since I started seminary. What's changed is people now have access to information they would have had to have been lucky to run across when I started out. High school students know some of these things. And I can remember, another story I didn't plan to tell. When I was teaching at Winthrop University, a young woman, we're still in touch, asked to make an appointment with me. I was teaching a course on Jesus, historical research about Jesus, and she came to my office, her face was red, and big tears, ugly tears, and I felt scared. I was afraid of her anger. And she was angry. And then she said, I'm not angry with you. I went to talk to my pastor about the things we were learning, and he patted me on the head, literally, patted me on the head and said, don't worry about it. But she knew, right, that I wasn't just making stuff up. So we're accountable in ways that those of us who are religious leaders, in ways religious leaders could get around back in the day. You can't get around it anymore. And so what do? I think the first step, I use that language from Peter Enns. Accept the Bible we have. Let it be itself. There's no way to read the Bible without some presuppositions and some commitments. None of us just read it the way it is. But allow it, right? Don't force it to make it work in ways that don't work. Acknowledge that there may be problems in passages that are being read aloud in church. Acknowledge it to yourself, acknowledge it in your conversations. Allow those things to be real. Like I shared, Christians have known this all along. Critical one. Be transparent about the choices we make as interpreters. And so, in my academic writing, I'll often say, look, I arrive at this conclusion aware that most people arrive at a different conclusion. These are the interpretive choices I'm making, knowing that there's really good evidence against the way I'm reading. This is why. Just be transparent about it. Accept also that the Bible isn't a book. And that may sound weird to some. But what I mean literally is, originally the Bible is a library, right? It's a collection of literature. The books of the Bible were not bound together for a very long time. And our earliest copies of bound copies of the New Testament are from around the year 200. It was a new technology. So you would write on a scroll. And so you would have all the different scrolls, right, somewhere in cubby holes. And so ancient people understood that the Bible was a collection of books. Allow them each to have their own voice and speak to each other. And as you read, allow yourself to have a voice. Read it dialogically. Talk back to it. See if it'll talk back to you. Be honest. I have a problem with this. And then the last thing, which is something almost none of us do, as much as we should do, in my opinion, is, yes, it's okay to read the Bible alone, but it's not okay to only read the Bible alone. We need to read the Bible in community, and preferably a community of people who don't share our background or life experiences. People who will bring perspectives that we wouldn't catch. I'll give just one example. When I went to graduate school, one of the members of my entering class in New Testament has become famous. Her name is Musa Dube. She's a Botswanan New Testament scholar. She was brilliant then. She's brilliant now. And years later, we decided to gather people together and write essays and publish them as a book in honor of our graduate advisor, Fernando Segovia. Musa wrote an article called Playing in the Dark. How often the Bible uses the imagery of darkness as imagery for evil. And how over the course of history, this isn't so much the Bible's fault, but over the course of history, Christians use that metaphor of darkness to talk about people whose skin was dark as a way of explaining why they were inferior and as a way of explaining why they could be enslaved. And Musa talks about her childhood in remote Botswana and how if it wasn't cloudy, it was never dark. I grew up in a small town. I haven't had many experiences of being out under the wide sky without light pollution. How many of you have had that experience? Yeah, it's not most of you. And if you're not used to it, it's just, you can see at night. And she writes about enjoying the dark, playing in the dark with her friends, playing hide and seek in the dark because you can find somebody, and how she loves the dark, and kind of reclaiming the darkness. Now, I share that way of reading because I can't have that thought without her. Are you tracking what I mean? Or sometimes I'll teach the story of Jesus' parable of the laborers in the vineyard. Landowner goes out early in the morning, a few hours later, a few hours later, a few hours later. And then at the end of the day, he pays the ones who have been working the shortest amount of time first and the others last. And you'll find people in a group, if they're diverse, having different reactions to that parable. Right? Some will say, well, he's the one who owns the vineyard. He contracted with them. He can pay them whatever they want, what he wants. And somebody else might say, I have punched a time card, an actual time card, and if I had to wait to get paid after I'd worked all day, I would be angry. There's something wrong with that parable. And it requires the different people in the room to have that conversation. So, accept the Bible the way it is, acknowledge, be transparent, accept that it's a library, read it dialogically, talking back and forth. But the hard one to do is find ways to read in community or at least learn from people whose life experiences and cultural contexts are different from our own, to raise questions we wouldn't think to raise. So I thank you for putting up with all that, and I think we have the time to have conversations. Steve is up, with not the microphone yet. And I think, didn't Bob say, or Steve said, you don't get to talk until you get the microphone? Yeah. Checking time. Oh, look at that, right
I think the book you were referring to with Kennedy Moss is God's Ghostwriters.
Yes, that is it.
Enslaved Christians in the Making of the Bible.
Yeah, God's Ghostwriters.
We actually just started doing a Bible study using that book.
Really?
I just bought it a week ago. It's amazing. Yeah.
One more thing. I was playing golf with Greg several years ago now, actually, I think. We were at Honeybrook Golf Club, and we were playing with two of my colleagues. I won't mention their names, but one of them said something about, in the Bible it says something, and Greg said, oh, the Bible says a lot of things. That, I think, is my favorite quote from Greg.
I am hardly a biblical scholar, but I am aware of my own impression is that the Bible, while maybe partly divinely ordained, has a lot of human color in it, and is really reflective of the mores and values of when it was written.
Sure.
And, so people are using it today to justify these very early evolutionary attitudes. And, it's almost like if you want to do something nasty, put it in the Bible and say, well, God ordained this. And then you can justify it. And, we see this a lot going on currently in this country. Mm-hmm. So that's one comment. The other comment I'd love for you to address, given your expertise, is the books that were omitted, like the Gnostic Gospels, and why. It strikes me a little, I know, that it had to do a lot with politics, and the perspective that the early church hierarchy, once it started to become more political in the Roman era, wanted to skew it that way. That's just my impression.
Most people don't like my answer to the second part. Most people who ask the question don't like my answer to the second part. For the first part, I have avoided language like inspiration for a long time. And the reason isn't that I necessarily don't believe in it. In fact, of all the churches, the church that has worked through that question best is the Roman Catholic Church, where they've articulated that inspiration doesn't cancel out the aspects of the Bible that you were just naming. And actually, Augustine and Origen got that. So I don't use the language of inspiration more because I'm a classroom teacher. If we're dealing with a problem in the Bible, and a student wants to say, well, don't you believe it's inspired? Then I want to know, well, how does it being inspired help you understand it? What does that mean for this problem? And so I resonate with where you're coming from in that one. I'd also say, though, why do we stick with it? And one of the reasons is, I find this to be true fairly frequently. We read the Bible because sometimes it speaks to us from that foreign place in ways we really need to hear. And surprises us, or challenges us, raises questions. And so I stick with it. But to your question about the canon, nobody ever voted on what got to go into the Bible until 1546. There was never an official list. And the reason they voted on it in 1546 was because Protestants were starting to translate the Bible, and they didn't include all the books that were in the Latin Vulgate. And so the Roman Catholic Church said, these are the books. And then the Protestants started saying, no, these are the books. Until then, what you get are 2nd century, 3rd century, more heavily in the 4th century, local bishops saying, these are the books we approve to be read in worship service. That's what the Bible was. The books we read in worship service. Didn't mean you can't have these other books. It meant we agree, we all agree on these. And the lists weren't all the same. They start getting pretty much the same in the 400s. And then Jerome translates the Bible from Hebrew and Greek into Latin. That gets bound between two covers. and that's effectively your Bible. But it's really not the case that, there were these machinations where they said, we got to come up with a list, now that we have an empire, all of that. There's no evidence for that. The way I think about the formation of the canon, sorry for the long-winded answer to that kind of question. The reason we have the books of the Bible we call the Bible now is because our ancestors in the faith kept copying and sharing their copies of those books more than other books. And so they became, you can imagine a stage where a church in one city in Syria might have had the Gospel of Mark, but a church in another city has Mark and Matthew, and somebody makes a copy. And then think about what we're talking about in the ancient world. How much would the material it would take to write Matthew on cost in the ancient world? Right? There are no paper mills. How much labor would it take to copy a biblical book in the ancient world? And what would be the cost, risk, and time associated with transporting a copy from, say, Antioch to Caesarea, or in the other direction? I feel almost devotional about that, because what it tells us is how tightly connected these churches were to each other across geographical distances. And eventually, by about the year 200, when we see Christians, they have spines with covers and they're putting their books together, you get something that looks a lot like the New Testament. But not quite, right around 200. So you get the sense of which are the books people are making the most copies of. We can pretty much game that out. And even to the degree of how widely they were being copied. So I think that would be my response to the question of how did it happen? But there wasn't somebody who decided we need to vote on that and decide for everybody else for a very long time.
Comment or question?
So, in the biblically illiterate world that we're in, lots of people are watching The Chosen.
Yes, I'm not, but yes.
So I've got a group of a dozen women that have been watching it now. They're finishing the third season, and it's really well done. It's very biblically accurate. So they watch an episode, and then all I do is sit there and read through the Bible and find out which story it is that they just told us. And then, after we watched it, we read it from the Bible and just kind of compare it. And it's art, right? Movies, video, it's art. So we can identify the places where they have taken some artistic license. It's amazingly well done. And so of these dozen women, maybe half have never really even read the Bible before. The other half were in Sunday school their whole life. So it's just a great conversation starter. I think it did us a huge favor in producing The Chosen, just because in our media savvy world, it's much easier to sit there for an hour and watch that.
It raises some curiosity. And
yeah, I just wondered what your opinion on it was. You should probably check it out.
You're right. I don't mean this, there's no snarkiness in this reply. Keeping up with what I need to be keeping up with is more than I've been able to do. And it hasn't been that way my whole career, but it is now. But I think you're probably right. And, the way you describe the series, it is an interpretation of. Just like the art, just like the sermons, just like the work I do is still interpretation. So that's all I know to say. I'd be out of bounds. But thank you.
growing up, we saw the King of Kings every Wednesday during Lent.
Every Wednesday.
Every Wednesday during Lent, we saw it. And the story just has different characters in it. It's the same story, I agree with.
You know, years ago, and I don't even think, I know I only saw a clip of this, I remember now. I was at an academic conference and someone was doing an analysis, I think it was Rob Seasongood, who used to teach here at Albright, was doing an analysis of the old David and Bathsheba, Gregory Peck, Rita Hayworth movie. I did not know until that day how I felt about Rita Hayworth. But there's this scene where she's bathing and David sees her. And does anyone remember the scene? As she exits, two attendants wrap essentially towels around her. And they're black. And I think the movie's like 1951. And just what was the effect on people seeing that movie and how they imagined that story at that cultural moment? So I'm not suggesting that interpretations aren't interpretations, and that because I'm a scholar, I get to have the authority over how the Bible. That's not how it works, and even if I thought it were, I'm not getting far. But we can be critics of those interpretations.
Other comments or questions? Wait, let's other people have a chance. Who has a comment or question before we go? Okay.
Yeah, more of a just comment. I just want to say how much I appreciate how you said reading the Bible by yourself, but how it's very important to read it with other people, other perspectives. When I came to Reading, I came here in 2013 after spending 5 years in prison. So the perspectives of somebody like me and other people in the community, but also spiritual exploration project, how important that's been in my life. Coming here from Reading, I was still struggling, still trying to find my way, and just having people like Carey and Steve and the grace they gave me and the learning experiences. And for me, my philosophy always has been, I don't go to a specific church. I like going to lots of different churches. I like going to lots of different events like jazz fest, things like that, and just absorbing life. Absorbing why do people believe in these things, Jehovah's Witnesses, Muslims, why do they believe in these kind of things, and not having anybody, put things in my mind, change my mind, make me believe the Bible the way they want me to believe the Bible, but just seeing why people believe in things. So I just really appreciate that.
Thank you. That's compelling. I'll just share, you may know, that there are schools that offer academic programs in theological studies in prisons. And my colleagues who have done that work say it's the most important work they've done. There is a book where one person tries to record what they've learned from it. Bob Ekblad, Reading the Bible with the Damned. That I just thank you for sharing that.
So let me ask you about this, though. I think there's also a level of perversion that takes place in the culture. You're talking about this show, The Chosen. What about like Left Behind? And how that has made an impact on the evangelical world for 15 years in some really horrific ways. Could you comment on that? I mean, I don't know if you've read, I read the first one and I almost threw up.
So I can comment on Left Behind. I do a lot of my research on ancient apocalyptic literature and Book of Revelation. And when my mom was living, she had read all the Left Behind novels. She was very proud of my books, but she hadn't read them. So Left Behind has a theological message. It also has a really heavy social political message. And people read it, as it's just entertaining, or I could learn about the end times from it. But when I went through the first one, and that's all I wanted to do, like the protagonist is a pilot named Buck Steele. A pilot named Buck Steele, you know. And he has a daughter who is in college at Stanford, and she's becoming an independent feminist. And it takes the rapture to get that out of her. For her to learn to become a submissive, more feminine woman. And, you know, I don't know how to say, how could you read that and not pick up on that? That's one of the reasons this novel is being written. It's not just, but to promote a certain patriarchal kind of order in society. So when we say these things, and on the flip side, Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown, you know, has its own set of values. And one of the moments I remember when I realized this is not good writing, I'm pretty sure page 47. When the male protagonist for the first time meets his love interest, she's going to see the mutilated corpse of her father. And Dan Brown spends a paragraph on how her body looks when she gets off the helicopter and it blows her dress against her body. And I'm thinking, you know, you can tell me this. Don't tell me this now. You know, it's just, you know. But there are other ways that it's had its own influence. And again, these are interpretations. They're interpretations. And, but they have other agendas mixed in. Just like, I will say, like all interpretations do.
So in your travels, have you seen a good model of diverse perspectives sitting down to study together?
We have enjoyed that at Lancaster Seminary. It has changed even since people in the room were in seminary not long ago. I can remember classroom conversations where, as a white instructor, I would try to introduce themes that had to do with race to students and try to find the way to do it and try to find a way to do it that didn't put, particularly because we would have a concentration of black students, put them in an awkward position and fail and not do it well. And then, at a certain point, maybe 10 years ago, we call it a critical mass of black students from the classroom. All of a sudden, one, I didn't have to pull that weight, and two, I didn't have control. And then the conversations became a whole different set of conversations. And, you know, students would hold me accountable in ways that I wasn't usually held accountable. These things do happen, but it's hard for churches to do it. One of the reasons, I don't want to take too much time answering this, but one of the reasons is because so many churches haven't accepted this, right? That there are ethical problems in the Bible. And so there's a culture when Christians in church settings talk about the Bible together. I experience this a lot. My bad joke that a lot of people have heard is, I visit more churches than the Holy Spirit. I'm just being invited to teach. And people are afraid to ask the question they have or say the thing they think or wonder about because somebody else might correct them. Because you just can't say that, right? We need to fix that somebody has this problem. And it doesn't get said. And that would make it hard to bring together groups of people who don't already know each other. You know, these things have to be organic, they have to take time. So, unfortunately, right now, I can't name a lot of places where I've seen that in church settings. Any?
Other comments or questions? I know we have one here, but anybody who hasn't had a chance yet, before we still have time, so if you have something, please.
I certainly don't want to have a discussion, but I thought of something else. My brother and I have very different views, and we grew up in the same family, a very church-going family.
Okay.
we both are very academic, intellectual types, and he turned into a hardcore atheist. And one of the reasons, he's an incredibly moral ethical man. So I guess you could call him a secular humanist. And I, have a great deal of faith and connection to spirit, but it comes from direct experience, not the Bible. And so I think my brother's complaints about religion and Christianity in general are things in the Bible justifying Netanyahu committing genocide. And so his view is that religion, all religions, have created more warfare, more violence than almost any other force on the planet. So how do you address that? I mean, that's a pretty loaded question, but it's so interesting to watch our divergent path, having been raised in the same household with very faith-filled parents. He's really hardcore atheist. It actually concerns me a little bit, but he's such a good moral person.
Sure.
But he watches things like in the Bible, and people use the Bible to justify heinous behavior. And that's where he's coming from.
And he's coming from a good place in that way. Couple of thoughts. Not speaking about your brother or you, because I don't know your background, wasn't there. I do have one person's public about this. Very prominent biblical scholar, teaches at the University of North Carolina, named Bart Ehrman. Bart was a fundamentalist Christian. He went to Moody Bible Institute. He wanted to learn all he could about the Bible, so he went to Princeton Theological Seminary to get a PhD. He was a superstar in grad school. But when he realized that you couldn't reconcile the problems he was encountering about the Bible, his relationship to Christianity was, if the Bible isn't trustworthy that way, then it all kind of falls apart. And he talks about it. He lives with a free conscience. He's not an aggressive. He's more like, I just don't believe. He's not aggressive or bitter about it. In fact, when he talks about it, you almost feel like there's a little bit of a sense of loss, but this is where I am. And, for some people, that sort of on-off switch is how they relate to religion and the Bible. And if it can't be trusted in this way or that way, they kind of did. That's part of it. The other thing he said, though, was religion in general has been implicated in everything. This is a little bit of an academic answer. I don't know what that debate necessarily means. And here's what I mean. I'm not trying to be sly about it. How do you separate religion from culture when almost every culture is religious? How do you measure out? I mean, do we, as those of us who are religious believers, want to say, well, Christians have done more good. Yeah, we've done some harm, but not as bad as the communists. Not as bad as the Nazis. Do we want to do that? Is that an argument that we want to have? Or, for me, I'm more comfortable saying religion is a human activity. And so, if there somewhere in the world is a place that doesn't have clean water, and somebody travels and finds clean water and establishes a well and a supply, the chances that those are Christians are higher than that it's somebody else. Does that mean only Christians would do it? Does it mean Christians are better people than other people? Does it mean that a less prosperous society that might not be Christian wouldn't do it if they were, I just don't know how to do that. And I realize that some people are in that place where, and very public intellectuals are in that place, where look at all the harm religion has done, and I don't, as a scholar of religion, know how to separate religion from culture. And that's not by having an interest in defending Christianity. What it means is Christianity doesn't dodge being a part of the problem. I don't know I do know that's not an argument that's going to happen and someone's going to, oh, right, you were right. That's not my experience. Sorry, I can't.
No, I like your last phrase, that Christianity doesn't dodge any part of the problem. Yeah.
Other comments or questions? Don't be shy. Anybody? I've already had one. Anybody have something before I take it up here?
I grew up at St. James Lutheran Church. I do not remember what Bible we were reading first. But then we switched to the King James Version.
Oh,
And then years later, we went to the Good News Bible, which got me thinking, why man is changing God's words? Why? Why do we need so many different versions of the Bible? There should only be one.
is it okay if I disagree?
You must.
Whenever you try to learn another language and you try to use that language with people who are native speakers, you're going to miss something, right? Or you're going to say the wrong thing. You're going to have this embarrassing moment. Because when you translate from one language to another, nothing is a perfect equivalent from one language to another. And so Christians, generally speaking, especially Protestants, have always translated the Bible. Written in Aramaic, Hebrew, and Greek. Almost nobody can read Aramaic, Hebrew, or Greek now. We have to translate it. The various translations that are out there are there to address primarily there to address different kinds of readers. So like the Good News Bible is written right at a 5th or 6th grade reading level. And there are a lot of people who, if they were reading the King James, would just be completely lost. Most of the translations that are widely used in churches are right at that 8th grade and 9th grade reading level. And it's always a question of where are the readers where you can help them understand what those ancient words meant in a contemporary English. And English changes. So, while I have translations I like better than others, I understand the decisions translation committees make in doing what they make. I'm not going to run down many translations for not being attempts to help people understand the Bible who wouldn't be able to otherwise. And I think there are too many of them.
I agree.
And the whole Revised Standard Version thing with the National Council of Churches is really what led to what we see as this fundamentalist divide, right? Because that's when conservative churches stopped supporting the National Council of Churches because of translation issues. So it can have big over the virgin birth.
I don't think that conservative churches were ever involved in the Revised Standard Version project.
No, but when it was produced, they disconnected from the Council of Churches because they changed virgin to young maiden.
Yeah, I think we have. This isn't my field, so I'm being careful. But my understanding is evangelicals formed the National Association of Evangelicals, and that those churches and the fundamentalist denominational churches did not participate ever in the National Council. I don't know that.
One last question, anybody? Before we hand it over to Harry. Does he has questions?
There's one. Harry, just make sure I get to say thank you before you take it.
It's not really a question, but you had mentioned about people know a lot more because of looking things up on the internet. And I have found that in Bible studies, because people would come in like, well, I didn't know what that meant, but I looked it up and this is what I found. And it also has completely changed the way I taught confirmation. the time. They
Yes.
look everywhere.
The internet is tough on religion, in particular because it's such a controversial issue that, we find when students are using the internet without getting a little coaching, they often get some pretty icky stuff. But it's there. It's there. And
It's a great talking point sometimes.
that's right. Thank you. Thank you all. This is a long time. It's night. You could be doing something else. I'm really grateful for the conversation and especially your comments and questions. Thank you.
So we want to thank you for a very stimulating presentation and the questions that have been raised during this evening. Last year I read a book called A Most Peculiar Book. And after reading that and looking at all the inconsistencies in the Bible, I thought Greg would be the ideal person to kind of bring that to our attention and help us understand it. All of life is exegesis. Everything is interpretation, especially the Bible. It's not only reading what's there, but looking at the words that were used in the original, and also trying to understand what the person was actually trying to say. It's like you and I talking with one another. I look at your facial expression. I try to understand the words that you're using. I try to understand where you're coming from. There's so much there that we need to interpret and to understand. This morning at our Soul Cafe, we had a presentation and a discussion on the Bhagavad Gita, and that was written about 500 years before Christ, or somewhere 500, 200. And after reading the Bhagavad Gita, I thought, Jesus actually got his hands on that. Because so much in the Bhagavad Gita is in the scriptures. And then when you look at other writings too, that there are so many similarities. So there is a kind of a cosmic truth that comes out through different people, through different characters that we revere. Like Thomas, like Muhammad, like Moses, like Jesus of Nazareth. And so it's all a process of discovering and rediscovering, interpreting, reinterpreting, and moving on. So I'm very grateful, Greg, for your presentation. I think you've opened the door for us to pursue this in other ways in the following years. What's coming up? We have, in our Spiritual Preparation Project, we have one more Soul Cafe. Diane Simon-Poitier and myself will be dealing with Christianity and reincarnation and looking at the elements that are in Scripture and what the Bible has to say about reincarnation. That will be next month, and that will be at West Lawn. And also, Steve, you want to say something about our Spirit on Tap program?
And that's May 28th, right? The next one. May 28th is our last one until the fall. St. Burke's, used to be Burke's Been in Crisis. We'll have someone from St. Burke's talking about not only what they do, but we're going to talk about some of the theological, spiritual ramifications that takes place in domestic violence and some of the ways in which they have to deal with folks, and some of the damaging ways in which the church, using the Bible in an immoral way, has promoted that kind of violence against women and children especially. So it should be a really excellent program.
And just a reminder, if you're not on our mailing list and want to hear about future programs, especially what's coming up next year, please put your name and email address on the sign-in sheets here. If you're already on it, don't bother signing it, because it's more for me to look it up. But if you want to get on there, write legibly. And also, we welcome your contributions. We do have incidental expenses, and we appreciate whatever you can donate to our cause. Anything else for the good of the Lord? Bob? Anything?
Thanks to the DoubleTree.
Thank you all for being here. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
See you tomorrow. Let's see you tomorrow. And we're going to pump you up.
That was good stuff.
They said that.
That